day for work here at the Happy Healthy Workplace podcast. I'm Kimberly Ficklin, your host. And every week we talk to professionals just like you all around the world because we want to find out what they do to create a profitable business, the kind of business where people really want to work.
Hello and happy healthy day, everybody. Today we're talking with Jeff Harry about how to infuse more play into the workplace to help your staff find their flow even now. Jeff Harry shows companies how to tap into their true selves all by playing. Jeff's worked for Google, Microsoft, the NFL, Amazon, and Facebook, helping their staff to infuse more play into the day-to-day. Jeff is an intentional speaker who has presented at conferences such as Inbound, SX, SW, and Australia's PozFest. Jeff was selected by Bamboo HR and Engagedly as one of the top 100 influencers of 2020 for his organizational development work. His play work has been featured in the New York Times article, How Do We Add More Play to Our Grown-Up Life Even Now?
So with that said, welcome, Jeff. Let's talk about what brought you to do what you do today.
Sure. The way in which I started Rediscover Your Play is when I was in third grade, I saw the movie Big with Tom Hanks, and he was playing with toys for a living. So I literally started writing toy companies, and I just did not stop for like 10 to 15 years until I got hired by a toy company in New York. And I thought it would be my dream come true, but when I got there, it was nothing what I expected. I felt like it didn't really matter if they were selling toys or selling microwaves. So I had my quarter life crisis. I left New York. I came to the Bay Area, and I found an organization that had 7 people already working for it, where they were teaching kids engineering with Lego. And I stayed there for 15 years, and we grew it into the largest Lego STEM education organization, like in the US, like teaching 100,000 kids a year. And while we were doing that, we got the attention of Silicon Valley because we were in the Bay Area, the Facebooks, Adobe's, Google's, and they would ask us to do a lot of these play workshops, like, oh, do you do, team building events? So we'd be like, sure. And then while we were running those team building events, I realized that at the same time they talked about creativity, connection, and collaboration, they didn't create the play atmosphere for anyone to do that. It wasn't a fun place to play and actually take risks. And a lot of times it seemed very tense. So I created workshops to address the underlying issues that a lot of companies are dealing with, like how do you deal with toxicity in the workplace? How do you create a more inclusive workplace where, it's anti-racist, right? How do you deal with inner critic? How do you deal with office politics so you don't have the meeting before the meeting and the meeting after the meeting? So it's like, how do I address these pain points that everyone typically avoids, but actually do it in a playful way?
Wow. Okay. So that's good stuff because as we had discussed, a little bit before we hit record here, is that I do play shops, but they're just for play. They're to help you become creative in the design process of your well-being or cultural initiatives. However, what you do it for is completely different, and the way that you do it is completely different. So I think that's important for us to point out here, because before we got on, you talked about positive psychology. So if you can talk to us, like dive a little bit deeper into that so that people actually understand what is the difference between different people's play shops, because a lot of people do play shops, right? So what is specific that is important about the psychology of being positive?
Right. So when a lot of people hear positive psychology, what they think of is toxic positivity, like someone that's just like, you got to be happy all the time and you got to just ignore everything and just be always happy. And that's delusional, right? And positive psychology was founded by Marty Seligman back in the 1980s, because he realized that psychology up until then had mostly focused on what was wrong with people. And barely any research was focusing on what is right with people, right? How do you move people from neutral to flourishing? How do you focus on what they're doing right? So that's what Marty Seligman and Dr. Csikszentmihalyi and a bunch of other professors out of UPenn started to study around that. So the way in which I incorporate that into my play work is a lot of times it's about like mindset. It's about addressing our negativity bias. It's about understanding how does one actually get into flow. There's like, scientific evidence that when you find yourself in a more flow state, what actually happens, and I'll get into some of the nerdiness right here, is just like usually your prefrontal cortex is like protecting you, right? That's where your inner critic lies. That's where it's like constantly making sure that you're safe and everything. But when you're in a state of flow, you go from beta to like this flow state where your prefrontal cortex, actually a part of it shuts down. And when it shuts down, it distorts time, and it also distorts your inner critic. It actually quiets your inner critic, which is interesting because then your implicit mind increases. You have more creativity. You get a shot of dopamine. All of a sudden, you're highly more curious. And then what you're doing now is, instead in that adult state where you're always focused on one result, you are able to let go of results and see all of the opportunities in front of you. So I help people figure out, or managers help their staff figure out, how do we get into that transient hypno-frontality state, that state of flow, so that they could do their best work, or as like Marcus Buckingham refers to it, as their red thread work, the work in which they forget about time, right? Mm-hmm. Their zone of genius, as Gay Hendricks calls it. So how do we get them back there?
Yeah, I love that you just said zone of genius. I actually worked through a book club with several other women through The Big Leap. And it was really interesting because actually the women told me is your zone of genius. And so I kind of accepted it as we were working together through the book. But later on, as I worked through my inner critic work more and more and more, and I could trust myself more, I actually came to find that that wasn't my zone of genius, what they had, said for me. But yeah, so it's interesting that you say that, because I also had to do inner critic work. I have had tremendous amount of trauma in my life, including in the workplace, and very, very toxic environments with incredibly toxic supervisors. I mean, to the point of legalities happening. You know what I mean? And it really, really, those traumatic experiences really changed me as a person. And I couldn't get to any creative state in my life because I was always working in this trauma. My inner critic was always working on that trauma, right? And so, man, I'm telling you what, I had to go through a lot of therapy, not talk therapy. I did some feedback and all kinds of amazing stuff. And the internal work of working through books like The Big Leap by Gay Hendricks and things like that, right? So I would encourage you right here, as we're discussing, when you're listening and you're wondering what you can do to even further your own psychological safety, your own, shut your inner critic down and start to work on your mindset, is pick up a book. The Big Leap is an amazing one to start with. So I'm really excited that you brought that up, Jeff, because you're right. I know I'm horrible at it. I am horrible because, again, we don't understand what traumas people have gone through that cause them then to allow their inner critic to be at the forefront at all times. So I'm going to step back now, with that said, and just have you elaborate on that a little bit, and why you know that it's important, and how you touch on that within your actual work.
Yeah, so let's just break down a play experiment that people can try at home, literally. And this was taught to me partly by my friend Marcia Chandor, who does this really cool talk about your inner beast. And what I created was I created a play workshop called How to Play with Your Inner Critic. And the steps, and these are ones that anyone can do, is one of the first things I recommend people do is you have to sense where your inner critic is. So you know that your inner critic is there whenever you feel bad. You don't know why you feel bad, but you just know you feel bad. So then you're like, why do I feel bad? So you start to listen and figure out, like, what is my inner critic saying to me? And then as soon as you start hearing those words, you start writing them down. Oh, I'm an imposter. Oh, I'm a loser. Oh, I'm always going to be alone. Oh, I don't deserve this job. Oh, I should never be promoted. I should always be paid very little for what I do. Whatever mean things that your inner critic is saying, write them down. There's something powerful about actually writing them down. And then what I have people do is I have them then look at what is written down and be like, what does that inner critic sound like? And what does that inner critic look like? Does it look like that bully Chad from high school? Does it look like third grade when people were teasing you? Does it look like adults that were shitting on you all the time? Like, it's always an amalgamation of many people, but like, what does it sound like and what does it look like? And after you've identified that, you've wrote it down, you know what they sound like, you know what they look like, then I say name it. And that's something powerful that Marcia taught me. It's just like, you name your inner critic. Mine happens to be Gargamel. So when Gargamel shows up, I'm able to identify, oh, that is separate from me. Oh, that is me from third grade. And the reason why your inner critic is there is it's there for a reason. It's there to actually protect you. The reason your mind has a negativity bias is because of the lizard brain, as everyone knows. And, you hunted long time ago and now it's protecting you, but you don't need it as much anymore. So when I see Gargamel showing up, then I'm like, thank you, Gargamel. I appreciate you giving me feedback from when I was in third grade. But right now, I'm going to have you sit in the back seat. You're not going to drive the vehicle. And one additional thing you can do if you want your friends to help you and you can help them is I text my best friend Dana sometimes when Gargamel shows up, and simply texting her. She doesn't even need to write me back, but simply texting her takes the inner critic away, because once then I'm able to read it and I realize how absurd of what I'm writing. And I'm like, is that really true? No, it's not true at all. And then also simply by letting someone else share with somebody else, then I know it's out there. And once you shine a light on the inner critic, it dissipates.
That was about 10 tips in one. So it wasn't just like, I'm going to give you a tip. That was unpacking a lot of really great stuff there. And I'm always listening as my guests are talking. I'm writing things down that I think are important to what you said so that we can come back to it. There's something to be said for putting pen to paper. Creatively, for me, I'm a Post-it note person. I work on a Scrum board. There's all kinds of crazy stuff that I do. But people have suggested that I go on to Trello boards and things like that. Now, I do have a Trello board and I use it. But when things stick with me better is when I've put that pen to paper, number one. And then I love the fact that you have encouraged us to use a powerful visual. Mm-hmm. So like I can see this I was a nutritionist. I still am a nutritionist, but I don't do that work anymore. And I would talk about ghrelin, which is your hunger hormone. And I had a little fluffy guy, like poofy, angry little guy, right? And that was actually the visual in my marketing. And so when I think of that, ghrelin. And so maybe mine will be called ghrelin. But I love that you gave us powerful visuals because, those things work for me. I know they don't work for everybody, but they certainly work for me. And then you came back with now text your friend. And the reason why I love that so much is because going back to when I was doing my lifespan integration therapy, the one thing that my therapist would say to me all the time when I'd say, oh, well, this happened to me. And then I probably shouldn't have been at the store. Maybe I shouldn't have been this and that. Mm-hmm. And she would say, hold on, that's your inner critic, right? Because it is, because now I'm trying to take control of why something that I have no control over happened to me. And she would say, how would you speak to your friend? Right. If your friend called you or texted you, as you were saying, and they told you the same thing happened to them, what would you say? And so those are really powerful tools you just gave us. Really powerful tools that can move you forward and really make you kind of be more introspective about how you can be really good to yourself.
Right. And when I'm running the workshop in person or virtually, I actually have people embody their inner critic and then talk to other inner critics, talk to other people that are doing theirs. So you start to see how absurd it is. You start to listen to Gargamel and you're like, Gargamel is horrible. Like, why am I hanging out with this guy? But one thing that's very important is you can't destroy your inner critic. You can't get rid of it. So I think a lot of people want to just slay it. It's like, it's there for a reason. It's just not needed as much anymore. So you just have to be able to recognize it because it wants to be recognized and then just put it in the back seat.
That is just wonderful advice. That's really great. So now let's talk about moving that, because we are speaking to people in the workplace, executives, CEOs, and people who want to know about what you bring to the table. How does that apply when you're working with people in the workplace? What do you see? So kind of break it down what a play shop exists of. Just, don't give us all your secrets, but how that work really gets done when you're physically working with a company. And then what do you see happening? What changes after people have gone through these types of play shops?
So it depends on what workshop I'm running, right? I just ran one for a biotech company, which was all about getting them in a state of flow. And what we did in that workshop is we had them explore what did they love to do as kids. right? Like I love to set up all my board games together and connect them all and have my sisters play them, like Mousetrap and Monopoly and, Chutes and Ladders and Candyland. And they hated that, but I loved it. But the reason why I loved it was because it was creative, it provided an experience, and it built connection. And I recognize those are my play values. So what we did with the company was we identified everyone, recognizing what their play values were. And then we tried to tie it to the work that they do now. What play values are connected in the work that you love to do the most? Oh, awesome. How much or what percentage of that work are you doing on a regular basis? Is it 5%? Is it 10%? Is there any way in which you can increase it just slightly? Because what we find is that when you are able to do your flow work, your zone of genius work, just a little bit more, it actually has a ripple effect, a positive effect on all of the other work that you do. And especially if you start your day with that positive work, that's amazing. So having said that, that's what I do for, my flow work, right? Or my future is where your fun is work. Now, when I'm dealing with toxic people in the workplace, my friend Gary Ware and I run a workshop called Dealing with A-Holes at Work Through Play, or toxic people at work. And I love to, because this is the Happy Healthy podcast, I love to break this down because this is actually really important if you want to eradicate toxicity from the workplace, right? So we first have people share how this might affect them. And when we did this in Australia, we saw people that were crying. We saw people that were like, I've left multiple jobs because of this. And then we saw people laughing afterwards because they realized like, oh, I'm not alone. This is amazing. And like, oh, you had that issue too. I can't believe you had this issue. And we forget that like SHRM just did a study in October of 2019, which said that Fortune 500 companies, only Fortune 500 companies have lost $223 billion due to toxic people, right? And that's just people, that's just companies that are willing to admit that they have toxic people in the workplace. So that number is probably higher. So what you could actually do at work is we do this, we break it down into 4 different steps. Your first is, because everyone knows who the toxic person is, you have to organize. So if that toxic person is taking up a lot of room in meetings, even in these virtual Zoom meetings right now, you work with the rest of your colleagues and you're like, look, this person's talking 80% of the time. Let's get each other's back, and when you are speaking and that person cuts you off, I'm going to speak and get you back in the game. We're going to get each other's back. So that's one way. You start to take up more space, right? The second is you confront the toxic person directly because they may not know that they're being toxic. So you might walk into Chad's office. Now you can't walk into Chad's office, so you contact him via Zoom and you go, hey, Chad, when you cut off Samantha at the meeting, it made her feel like she didn't want to share anymore. And also what it communicates to the rest of us is you don't want to hear what we have to say. Is that your intent? So you just want to be careful and clear of like, is that their intent? Maybe it isn't their intent, right? So you address that. Now, if it was their intent because they just happen to be that toxic, then at that point, then you have to look at, okay, what are the values of this organization? What is the mission of this organization? And you go to his, supervisor and you're like, yo, is Chad representing what we need here? Because as Simon Sinek talks a lot about, he talks a lot about the brilliant jerk and how Navy SEALs will not pick the brilliant jerk, regardless of how amazing they are. And the brilliant jerk's the person that usually brings in so much revenue, but is just mean to everybody. And the reason the Navy SEALs never pick that is it destroys the team. And you've seen it so many times on sports teams where the best player leaves and then all of a sudden the whole team thrives. So you have to explore that. Do we want to keep Chad if it's at the expense of Samantha and John and all these other people that are leaving because of him? Because turnover is super expensive. And do you want to deal with that? And then finally, if they don't want to deal with all that, right, there's something else that's happening. And this kind of ties with what we talked about earlier, which is you have your inner critic. You have your inner a-hole that when Chad speaks to you, it triggers something in you. Mm-hmm. So by you doing your inner critic work, the next time Chad says something to you or cuts you off or is just super rude, you can be like, Chad, that's super rude. Don't ever speak to me that way. And when you do that, not only are you setting a boundary for you but you're also communicating to all your other colleagues, oh, man, look at that. He's stepping up to Chad, and then they're more brave to set their boundaries as well. And then Chad has a choice. Chad either has to get his stuff together, right, and start treating people with respect, or Chad's got to go because he can't bully people anymore. So doing all of those steps can be a really great way in which you can eradicate a-holes from your workplace.
Again, Jeff, amazing steps. Those are great. And, I was basically that person always in work, which is probably why I had so many traumatic experiences, because I did have boundaries. But I'm also the underdog lover. So I spent a lot of time, and probably I didn't do it right. I've said it on the podcast before because I was young and didn't really know how to communicate with people correctly. But I would challenge my supervisors a lot in the way that they made other people. I was always in management. So I'd be like, why are you treating Susie? Susie just ran out of your office crying. What's happening? And then I'd be in trouble, right?
Right.
So I had a lot of boundary issues in work, but I was able to overcome it. And the other thing that you pointed out, I think was really important is, and again, we've said this so many times on the podcast, is that even if you have the best salesperson in the world, and they're the worst toxic person you've ever been, it is costing your company. So the bottom line, which people don't like to look at, they're looking at this top line, the salesperson that's way up here bringing in all this money, but they don't realize that, like people like me, I had regional sales managers that were horrible to me, even though I was bringing in a lot of money and I wasn't toxic. Right. And this is the thing, this is the irony of it all. They would say to me, oh, if you think you cry at work, which I did, we cry every day. There's tissue in our boss's office, who, by the way, it was a bunch of females and a male boss. And he would just be like, deal with it, and it's so amazing to me that these things actually go on. I did put my boundaries up, which is honestly why I had so much trouble in the workplace. Now, moving forward into a happy, healthy workplace, I didn't even know that a happy, healthy workplace existed, which is why I do what I do. It's why I have the podcast, because I don't always interview just professionals like you that help workplaces, but I also interview like the top healthiest workplaces in Oregon. And I ask them what they're doing as well. And what that's done, honestly, Jeff, it's a very selfish thing, although I love what I give to the value that comes from these conversations to the audience. It's more to fill myself up because I have so many years been in toxic places, and I needed to know that there was other places and that people were doing the right thing. And I think that with this COVID thing and going virtually and doing all kinds of, it is the biggest crack in the workplace that's ever existed. It is a global pandemic, not just something that happened to one country or another country. And what it's doing is opening up conversations just like the one you and I are having about toxic workplaces and how to create happy, healthy, creative, and productive employees who will do anything for you because they love how you treat them. That's what's important. It's not the dollars. It's not the money. Now, everybody needs to put food on their table. But I promise you, they'd rather you treat them well and that they know what they do in the workplace and how it affects the workplace, right? So they know what their contribution is. That's important. Those things are more important than the title of senior account representative, which places like to do a lot, just give you more work and not give you more pay or even treat you better, right? So I love that we're talking about this. I need to bring it to a close here, though. We've gone a little bit over, Jeff, but you know what? I really like what we're talking about today. I'm super passionate about everything, the psychology, the inner critic. These things are so important. And I know, again, just because I did my own work, because of the trauma. So if you're listening today, one thing that I would like to pound in before I ask Jeff his last question here is that if you do not work on your inner critic, the hardest thing you'll ever do in life is try to put boundaries up for yourself. Because you'll put them, which I did, but then I let people crack my boundaries because they had more power than I did, okay? It doesn't have to be that way when you've done your inner critic work. Because you can look at people and say, you don't mean anything to me. You don't value me. I don't value you. So I'll just go find another workplace that does. Would you agree, Jeff?
Oh, completely. Absolutely.
Okay, wonderful. So here we go. Last question of this interview, Jeff. And thank you so much for being a guest today. You've been amazing. The content you've brought has been very, very valuable. So in closing, do you think there's anything that needs to be said that we did not say today?
Yeah, when I think of a happy, healthy workplace, especially in the virtual setting, I think one thing that managers can consider doing is spend time focusing on what needs to get done and spend more time checking in with their staff and really focusing on connection. And you can even do an experiment where you could be like, do a week where you just focus on the results and what they have to get done, and then just do a week where you're just there trying to connect, trying to build that relationship, checking in on their mental health, really, and just being there for them. I even know someone that they just have virtual lunches every day. They don't talk about work and they don't talk about what they need to get done. And because I think we're in such a unique time period that this is when humanity needs to step up and productivity needs to go down. And what's ironic is by not attaching your self-worth to productivity and actually being more human, you might get more out of your staff without even having to ask, because they know that you now care even during this crazy time.
Well said. And I would even drive that in further that it's not likely that it will happen. Statistics show that it absolutely 100% will bring up your engagement, your surveys that say that they love their workplace, as well as the reviews that they give to you online when they are working for you and leave. So this is important stuff, which Jeff shared with us today. Jeff, I am so happy that you came on and talked to us today about this very, very important topic. So this is the close of the happy. Actually, I'm going to go back and thank you again, Jeff. Thank you so much for coming. Give you an
Absolutely.
opportunity.
Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. Give you an opportunity to say something. So this is the close of the Happy Healthy Workplace podcast. Check the show notes for links to Jeff and all of the resources that both he and I shared on the show. Please remember to share this episode with someone that you know will benefit from it. This is Kimberly Ficklin, your host, wishing you a happy, healthy day. That's a wrap for today. The Happy Healthy Workplace podcast is now complete. Be sure to subscribe and join us weekly for secrets, solutions, or strategies that help you create a profitable business where people really want to work. This is Kimberly Ficklin, wishing you a happy, healthy day.